Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video, giving you the extra nuggets to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the conflict in Ukraine. So much to talk about as ever. I sometimes wonder, what is it I'm doing? Am I just projecting onto you what I find interesting? This is what I find fascinating. Therefore, you're going to find it fascinating. I just package it up and throw it at you. Yes. Is this just I am an aggregator of information. So basically, I do the legwork of going to look at all these disparate sources and different sources and pick elements of those sources and then put them in here. Like I've got a few parts of videos today that I think are really, distilling maybe an hour's worth of video down to the core parts and then show that to you. So that maybe that's my service I'm providing to you, and that I give you a bit of my sort of commentary as well, and hopefully you find that interesting. So I don't know, this is what it is, and thank you for coming along this journey with me. I'm going to go first to aircraft. So Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, has said that if the British government were to give fighter jets, it would also have to provide about 200 Royal Air Force personnel. In other words, it's no easy thing to provide these jets, and there's so much involved with that. And I keep referring you back to this conversation between Ward Carroll and Royal United Service Institute's Justin Bronk. This is an absolutely fantastic conversation that will give you all you need to know about the difficulties with providing jets to Ukraine, and the whole panoply of jets that could be provided from different nations. Basically, 90% can be just thrown off the list because they're just not the right type of jets for the job that needs to be done, and you're left with very few types of jets, and even then there are problems with using them, not least that they are designed for use in a NATO kind of framework of combined arms operations, and this isn't a NATO combined arms operation. This is a war between a Soviet nation, effectively Russia as a Soviet nation, and a former Soviet nation using largely Soviet doctrine still, at least to some degree anyway. And NATO jets just don't fit into that easily. Anyway, this conversation and this part of the conversation kind of summarizes that. So Justin Bronk is this guy on the right. He's from the RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, which is a UK military think tank.
But so to take a few things, because I see a lot of this stuff stemming from some really positive and well-informed observations around the basing requirements. I see a lot of people saying, well, okay, wouldn't Harrier have been a good idea? What about light attack aircraft? A-10, because well, at least it's rugged, it can do lots of stuff. Tornado, because they've been retired. And essentially, I think just to kind of take a lot of those as a whole, because the problem is all the same. The Ukrainians' primary requirement is for air-to-air capability that works at low level in an extremely contested surface-to-air missile engagement zone. None of those options have any chance against Russian fighters head-to-head anyway, let alone at low level in a very, very dangerous multiple layers of SAM threatened block of airspace. So none of them work for the requirement. There's a very good reason why people kind of default to those things, and often I also see this linked to tanks. People saying, well, tanks require air cover. Without air cover, how can we? It's a waste to send tanks, almost as a justification for trying to convince people to send aircraft. That only applies to the way we fight. We in the West have configured our militaries for 70 plus years to rely on air power to allow us to have outsized battlefield effect with very small, comparatively speaking, land forces. So and our primary and pretty much required first step in any serious conflict of any kind is to establish air superiority, because that's where the majority of our firepower comes from. It's where the majority of our force situational awareness comes from. But that's because that's the way we've built our forces, because we can. So that is increasingly harder and harder, specifically because it worked so well for so many decades. Russia and China as well, but in this case, Russia, because it's the relevant one, have specifically designed their modern integrated air defense systems, so they're mobile, surface-to-air missile batteries and all the radars and the architectures and everything else that connect them to negate that air power advantage. And so, people say, well, NATO air power, would do this. We need to give the Ukrainians NATO air power. That's not going to work. NATO would struggle to establish air superiority over the Ukrainian front lines. It would take months to get all the logistics and the maintenance and the training and all of the complex air operation packages and everything ready. And so the idea, and even then we would lose aircraft and there would be horrendous risk of escalation and all of that stuff. Yes, we would eventually be able to do it. It's not that NATO couldn't write down the Russian integrated air defense system and then ultimately have extremely powerful battlefield effect with direct attack munitions of various kinds, as we've had in other conflicts. But it would be it would be a long campaign, a long process. We would lose aircraft, and that's with the whole panoply of support. That's with all the ISTAR aircraft, so the intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance aircraft, so things like rivet joint, joint stars that go out there and map an IADS, track where all the emitters are, map how it all works, what frequencies they're on, all the electronic warfare support, so things like the Growler, previously the Prowler, Compass Call, increasingly things like Wedgetail. The US is investing a lot now in active electronic warfare for precisely this requirement. All of the suppression assets, so things like harm, but that's just one aspect. You're just suppressing with that. You're not really getting hard kills most of the time. Loads of very high-end jammers, things like Mold X in particular, which can kind of jam and also spoof being an aircraft, so try and stimulate those defenses and force them to engage things. Loitering munitions of various kinds, and all the strike aircraft plus fifth gen, with things like F-35, F-22, B-2, B-21 coming in. All of that stuff would still be required. It would take weeks to write down that Russian IADS once you had everything in place. So the idea that by giving the Ukrainians a handful of Western fighters, with none of the other enablers, let alone the years of training, not just the aircrew, but all of the training and the career's worth of expertise in running those operations that our commanders have in CAOCs, so Combined Air Operations Centers, to actually sequence, plan, brief, command these sort of complex operations. You just can't port that across into another country, especially one that's never operated air power that way. So yes, Western aircraft will be needed by the Ukrainian Air Force. Yes, they would be a significant improvement on their current jets. Yes, we should get them, but we shouldn't be under illusions as to what they will accomplish and what they're for. They will not establish battlefield dominance over the Russian army in Ukraine. That is not possible with a handful of Western jets. And most of our ground-to-air capabilities are intended for use from medium level with a targeting pod outside of a SAM missile engagement zone, with well-trained pilots with JTACs on the ground. They're not intended for employment from very, very low level under a high-end threat picture, lobbing weapons from a couple of kilometers away, which is what you'd have to do in Ukraine, and what the Ukrainians and the Russians, of course, the Russians too have faced this problem. This is the whole reason the Russians don't have air superiority, is they can't do this against a much lower end air defense system. The Ukrainian air defense system is massively less capable than the Russian one. And yet the Russian Air Force, which for all its flaws, has a hell of a lot more capability stored up in it than a handful of Western jets given to Ukrainian pilots with a few months conversion training, however brave and skillful they are. The Russian Air Force has been unable to establish air superiority over the battlefield just facing the Ukrainian air defenses. So we really do need to be realistic about this.
And it goes on. I advise you to watch that. He's absolutely spot on. And during this, he talks about how Gripen, the Swedish fighter, is probably the best fighter for the job, the best aircraft for the role, given how it can take off from rougher, shorter airfields. The FOD, these bits of debris on the airfields that is a problem for Ukrainian airfields, won't get sucked up into the plane as much as, say, for F-16s and other Western fighters, and so on and so forth. And it's much better in the role it would be envisaged as using, so on and so forth. So Gripen is probably the best, but the chance of that being given, in meaningful numbers, and what it would entail, it's quite unrealistic at the moment. This is why we see these Western governments saying kind of repeatedly no, 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 because and he talks in this about, you know, if you can have a set amount of money that you can throw at this, or resources or time or whatever, it's like, do we put that into the aircraft that might have some effect on the battlefield, or do we put it into, I don't know, you know, main battle tanks, or training up people on IFVs, or giving these sort of systems over here? uh, you know, it's the cost benefit analysis of each of these decisions, and the aircraft decision, you know, is getting shunted down a list of priorities for all the reasons he's given there. Just, you know, the amount of air defenses on both sides, you know, Ukraine, he talks quite a lot about how cautious the Russian air services have been. As soon as they just take one or two losses, they then retreat back and start doing things further back. It's really interesting. The last couple of weeks, we've seen them start to be a little bit more risky to try and do that combined arms initiative and support the ground troops in the Bakhmut area, and then they get hit. You know, and that's a Ukrainian air defense system, which is, you know, arguably far less capable than the Russians with their SAM 300s and SAM 400s and so on and so forth. Throwing them like 10 F-16s or whatever is not going to be the panacea that I think people think it is. And even I was thinking, you know, I've been arguing that we should do that. It's not to take them off the table, but it requires an awful lot more thought and a heck of a lot more wider range of support than just giving those aircraft. There are these other support things that need to be in place, and he's talking a lot about SEAD activity, suppression of enemy air defense, which needs to happen at the beginning of the war. That hasn't happened on either side, so there's contested airspace, which means that using those kind of aircraft is hugely problematic without that air superiority. So the first thing you need to do is absolutely hammer those air defenses, so on and so forth. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is another piece of equipment that is not being given to the Ukrainians, and there's been so much conversation about it. It's the ATACMS. What is the ATACMS, and what has been given? Just to remind you that HIMARS are these high mobility artillery rocket systems, the M142, and they usually send up pods of rockets, a number of guided rockets that then have, with Ukraine at the moment, the rockets they are able to use that the Americans have given them have an 84-kilometer range, so a pod of 6 MLRS, or it can send one ATACMS. So with the slightly different pod, they send one big old ATACMS, and that is a sizable rocket. But this has a 300-kilometer range, so it's got a far greater range. It'll just be a case of kind of swapping the pods over to these ATACMS and then using them. Why don't we give them these ATACMS? I've been calling out for it. Lots of people have been calling out for it. And there's been lots of conversation about this article from The Drive being one particular one, talking about, you know, Ukrainian HIMARS can't fire long-range ATACMS missiles, you know, why that is or isn't the case. But Jake Bro 3 months ago, who's another YouTuber, does, you know, far bigger than I'll ever be, who had a chat on this, and some of the arguments he provides actually make a lot of sense as to why ATACMS isn't being provided. So I'm going to let him do the talking here.
Now, the first factor we have to consider is cost. How much does one...
And he's comparing HIMARS, like a pod of 6 HIMARS missiles, to a pod of 1 ATACMS missiles. Like HIMARS, like 84-kilometer range missiles, guided missiles, versus the one bigger one.
One of these larger, longer range missiles cost to give to the Ukrainians. And according to a Military Today article, I'm seeing $820,000 for a single missile, but this figure is probably a couple years old. So I think it's appropriate to round up and say about $1 million for a single longer range ATACMS missile. Now with the Gimlers, the shorter range, I've seen estimates from 100,000 up to this War Zone article where some official was quoted as saying 168,000 per missile. So we're going to round up and use the more expensive figure. And it's important to remember how many missiles are in a pod for the Gimlers. When you're launching the smaller missiles, you can fit 6 in a cartridge, 6 in a pod. But when you launch an ATACMS, it's just one. This thing is huge. It takes up an entire pod, an entire missile. So here's the cost breakdown and the basic target breakdown comparing the two. And for 6 Gimlers, it costs about $1 million. For a single ATACMS, once again, costs about $1 million. Now, with these missiles, they're both GPS guided. You can independently target 6 different sites if you really want to, if you have GMLRS. But with an ATACMS, you're only hitting one place that night. If a HIMARS crew can get maybe 1 or 2 cartridges fired off in an evening before they have to shoot and scoot, they're not targeting as much when using ATACMS. So this already gives Gimlers a slight advantage for the same cost structure. You can target 6 different sites. Now the Ukrainians do double tap and triple tap lots of these sites to make sure they go boom, but still you're getting more done by using Gimlers as opposed to ATACMS. The other consideration that I don't hear people talk about ever when considering ATACMS is how effective is Russia's air defense systems against Gimlers and against ATACMS. Russia has 2 deployed air defense systems operating in Ukraine. There's the older Soviet S-300 missile system, and then the more modern, I guess more capable S-400 missile system. And this is the meme on the internet the last 4 months. What the heck has Russian air defense been doing as all of their fuel warehouses, ammunition depots, command posts, they've all been destroyed by the Ukrainians? Russia's S-300 and S-400 air defense systems prior to this war were considered to be pretty darn good. But so far they've been proven to be incapable of shooting down Gimlers. And at this point in the war, this is a proven fact. Russia's air defense systems are useless against Gimlers. And I suspect that the Pentagon and NATO knew this when they decided to supply Gimlers and not ATACMS 4 months ago. It is possible that there could be a software update in which Russia's air defense system gets its act together and they can start shooting down these Gimlers. But because they're smaller missiles that go a shorter distance, they're just not in the air as long, and their radar systems get confused thinking they're just simple artillery rounds. But let's now consider the ATACMS. This is a much larger missile for Russian radar to spot and track. It stays in the air longer, once again making it easier for radar to spot and track. So this might be the answer why the West has not provided Ukraine with ATACMS. They're not confident that ATACMS missiles will actually hit their targets because Russia's air defense systems might be able to actually shoot them down. So what the West has been doing the last 4 months is supplying Ukraine with weapon systems to destroy Russia's air defense systems. A big force multiplier in this war was
So it goes on to talk about, harm being used, and this being the way. These were, it's big news when they were providing harm missiles. So these are the missiles that take out radiation, sources of radiation. You fire them from jets, and they will take out a radar installation, which then means possibly going forward, the US could supply ATACMS and be able to get through those air defense networks. But I think it's a really interesting point that, bang for your buck, ATACMS have got a stronger chance of being shot down by air defense. Gimlers aren't getting shot down. You're getting 6 pops, even though they're probably smaller missiles. They are getting through there. They'll be having devastating effect behind the Russian lines up to that kind of 90-kilometer range mark. It's just too much of a risk to give ATACMS at the moment, but could it be that we see them being given going forward? We shall see. He then goes on to say, he calls it a logic flow, where it's the first of all, the US has decided ATACMS aren't the best for Ukraine, or NATO's decided ATACMS aren't the best for Ukraine. convince the Russians that you are doing them a favor by not providing them. Well, hey, we're not escalating, we're just providing gimbalers. If Russia collapses, they won't be needed. But if it escalates, if the conflict escalates, then they always can go, actually, we're going to give you ATACMS now. And then, once there's a critical failure of the Russian air defense, that's the time to provide those ATACMS. So I think this is a pretty good analysis. There's probably lots of more things you can think about, but simply, if you're looking at cost and the chance of it getting taken down, then gimbalers do make sense. But the question is whether we've got to a point, whether Ukrainians, sorry, I say we because I'm thinking like as NATO, whether Ukraine have got to the point where all of those targets have been effectively taken out in that 84 kilometer, 90 kilometer range, and whether they are just now starting to think, well, what can we hit? Are there other things? And that's kind of like, okay, we really, they've moved their depots back behind that mark. We now need attackers. We now need something else. So whether that point has been reached, or whether obviously NATO are obviously thinking in a cost benefit analysis, it's not worth our while sending ATACMS. I mean, they're obviously thinking that because they're not sending them. So, yeah. This is a comment from the Joint Chiefs Chairman General, Mark Milley, declaring that Russia has lost the war in Ukraine. Quote, they've lost strategically, operationally, and tactically, and they are paying an enormous price on the battlefield, he says. While Russia has waged this war for far too long, they will not outlast Ukraine's people, nor the group of allies and partners that met today. This is an interesting statement, the idea that they've lost, and he's obviously talking about this, well, he's talking strategically, operationally, and tactically, which is to say they've lost the war. I agree with this, and I think I wrote in April last year, as I keep telling you, an article saying that there's no way Putin can win. I mean, he can't win. But I think there's maybe a difference saying you can't win and they have lost. And what Milley here is, what he's doing is kind of predicting the future or seeing where this is going, which is say, I can see no way that they can win, which is to say they have lost. But I don't, semantics maybe. I think it's possibly, as Shashank Joshi here says, it strikes me as nonsense. Strategic loss is one thing, but if you are grinding out modest advances in Donbass, then that's a tactical gain by definition. The point is that these gains are coming at a cost which, in all likelihood, will imperil Russia's position down the line. I think that's what Mark Milley's doing. Is he's looking at it down the line. I think it's dangerous to say they have lost already, because if you start saying that in public, then people will go, oh, okay, we don't need to support Ukraine. We don't need to keep putting all this money in military aid and humanitarian aid forth, and so on and so forth. But actually, it's saying, well, given all these things remaining in place, then Russia will lose. Ergo, they have lost. I mean, we're just making a really surefire prediction for the future. Again, be worried about hidden variables and unknown variables and predicting the future that we don't know, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's quite a risk to say something like that, although I kind of agree with why he's kind of said that. Okay, going to talk, or going to listen to, I know this is the third time I'm putting on someone else to say something, but these are all just really great nuggets of information here. This is coming from someone on the Ukraine Latest podcast, a military man, Ben Barry, Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I think he's former forces himself. And this is his kind of appraisal of the war.
Thanks so much, Ben. Just one more quick question from me, if that's all right. What do you see as the main obstacles for both sides going forward, and what would you recommend our listeners look out for in the next few months? What will you be looking for in the conflict in the months to come?
Well, probably best if I just give you a quick burst on what I see as the shape of the war.
Please, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple of minutes, but Ukraine has stated plans for counteroffensives to push the Russians out of their country. And for this, they've said they want at least 10 armoured brigades with modern Western armour. And the key thing about the modern Western armour is it's much better protected than obsolete Western armour or indeed Soviet-style armour. So that's why they've requested 1,000 modern armoured fighting vehicles, 300 tanks and the remainder infantry fighting vehicles. Now, we're monitoring the declarations by Ukraine's allies, and as at this morning, we reckoned that what was declared that could reach Ukraine by the summer was about 25% of this. What does Moscow seek to do?
That's a very interesting sort of state of affairs, isn't it? So Ukraine know what they want. You might think they're pushing the envelope, saying we want all this, but at the end of the day, they want to win the war. So they're asking for stuff that will enable them to win the war. Plenty of enough military equipment to win that war. So X amount of stuff, 1,000 pieces of this. Well, actually, you're going to get about 25% of that. Okay, what does that say about how easy it's going to be for Ukraine to take this to the Russians? Well, not as easy as they're hoping. I mean, it's not underwhelming. They've been given loads of stuff, but is that enough?
Well, Putin has not changed his objectives of regime change in Ukraine, and he seems to be playing it long in terms of wanting to outlast Ukraine and its allies, and is willing to accept heavy losses in doing so. He's also stated a medium-term objective of achieving full control of the Donbass and of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts. Now, it's not clear to me that as things currently stand, the Russian army can concentrate enough capable and competent formations to achieve this. So in the meantime, Russia will continue to fortify its defences and continue also to attempt to pin Ukrainian forces and inflict attrition with these First World War style artillery and infantry attacks. We can also expect intermittent Russian missile and drone attacks on civilian infrastructure. But remember that every single missile and drone that's fired at a civilian heating plant, an electricity plant, or indeed a railway junction box, is a missile that can't be fired at military targets. Now, for both sides, spring will make attacking easier, and political factors impel both sides to attack. Now, whichever side...
On the one hand, it will make it easier. On the other hand, you will have all the muds that come with spring thaw. So there is a theory to say that actually attacking now, as the Russians are doing, is the sensible option rather than waiting a couple of months and then getting seriously bogged down.
Attacks first will get both politically and military first mover advantages, but will also expose themselves to counterattack by the defenders' artillery and ammunition. Now, quite clearly, the Russians are busy fortifying their positions to achieve that. Construction of linear defences, anti-tank ditches and rows of dragon's teeth. The Ukrainians also have probably developed defences in depth, and both sides may well be holding armoured reserves at the tactical and operational level, so that if a successful attack is staged by their enemies, they can then delay it and counterattack it. But provided Ukraine is supplied with sufficient ammunition and modern Western equipment, and this continues, I think the balance of political and battlefield leadership, as well as the Western weapons, will probably give Ukraine tactical advantage. But it's not clear that Kiev has enough combat power to eject Russian forces as quickly as it or its supporters would like. Now, we have to remember this has been a terrible war. I was in the war in Bosnia, and that was bad enough, but this is much worse. And we can expect another bloody year, I think, with unpredictable action-reaction dynamics as both sides stroll for the initiative at the strategic, operational and tactical levels. So that's as I see it from my humble desktop.
Very interesting. And Russia are playing for the long game. They will be putting on this offensive. Ukraine will be looking to this offensive, having their own kind of idea where they want to do their own counter-offensives, but they will need to adapt to what Russia are doing, whether they'll leave themselves open for a counter-offensive on that offensive, or whether Ukraine keep to their original ideas of where they would like to do their counter-offensives. So, for example, I'm just kind of make this up, but if Russia push really heavily against Crimea and do an offensive around there, it may be that Ukraine had originally envisaged doing an attack down to Mariupol, maybe from Vuhledar, or I don't know, down to Melitopol or whatever, and then maybe doing one up near Svatova. Again, making this up. Russia do their offensive here and then leave themselves ripe for a counterattack and actually weaken the flanks maybe at the base of where they attacked. It could be that Ukraine have to react to that and say, okay, we're not going to do this fatter attack now. We're going to adapt to attacking here at the base near Kremina, and then so on and so forth. So, they will have their ideas of what they need to do, but those may be adapted. But we're in this for possibly for the long haul. So the Russian offensive, then the counteroffensives, and then probably mass mobilization or mass mobilization during that for the Russians and possibly even for the Ukrainians. And then this will be Russia hoping that support for the war will lessen with Ukrainians' allies, and that they'll eventually be able to win this war of attrition by using time to their advantage. And of course, data like this that I already talked about today plays into that, which is American polling saying that 48% of people in the US claim they favor the US providing weapons to Ukraine, with 29% of Americans being against giving Ukraine military aid, and 22% say they neither support or oppose nor oppose further aid to Ukraine. In May 2022, so less than 3 months into the Russian full-scale invasion, so that's 9 months ago, 60% of Americans claim they're in favor of supplying weapons. So that has dropped 12%, and that is a significant drop in support for American aid. Whether that's as a result of people like Tucker Carlson and certain people in the media attacking the Ukrainians, kind of being Russian appeasers and attacking the government, whether it's because that's what Biden wants to do, therefore we're going to attack Biden, we're going to attack the Democrats because we're staunchly Republican. I know a lot of you listening are Republicans who don't feel that, so I'm not tarring everyone on the same brush here, but I'm trying to explain that there are people on the right in America who are doing this. I don't know whether that's having a meaningful effect on the people watching that, or whether this is a general, kind of, to use a military term, a general attrition of people's support, because actually a year's a long time. You start thinking about other things. You're not watching channels like this on a daily basis. You don't know where Ukraine is on a map. You don't really care because actually you're worried about the cost of fuel. You're worried about, keeping your job in an economic, precarious economic situation, so on and so forth. There are other things that you're worried about. And then you hear the headline of America giving another $10 billion of aid to Ukraine, and you think that's money out of kind of your pocket, as taxpayers' money that's going and being shunted to a war on the other side of the world. And actually you want your whatever support from the government yourself. And so you kind of, even if that's misleading, that's not quite an accurate representation of how aid gets to Ukraine. And where that money is taken from. If that's not been communicated to you successfully because you're watching certain sources, or just in the absence of any source, you just don't hear about this, then you're going to have your support for Ukraine, even though it's a moral support initially, it's going to be eroded away because there are other priorities in your life. I think one of the main things now is to keep that support up there for people. That is, although I'm trying to be accurate with what I say, I also have a moral agenda, not an agenda, but I have a moral position. And I would like to see that support for Ukraine maintained. And I'm playing a tiny, tiny little part in that. And people attack me for not being, objective enough. Well, it's difficult because I am supportive of Ukraine. I'm morally and politically against Russia, but I want to be accurate with what I report. However, I have my own curated news sources, and I'm probably not enough reporting to you the losses that Ukraine are making. I am aware of this. And so there is this, am I just presenting good news all the time? So I will be thinking about my own little sort of pile of sources and how I curate that going forward. But I also do want to see that support for Ukraine maintained, because I think it's super important geopolitically and morally speaking. Anyway, that's just a little sidebar. Let's now move on. And just to then cycle back to, well, what are the Russians doing at the moment? This is, hashtag ATP 007. Again, I reckon these experts are watching my videos, because this is exactly what I've been saying the last couple of days. Obviously not. Again, I always say this. New Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine, more aspirational than realistic, says Western officials. This is from CNN. US and UK and Ukrainian officials tell CNN this same kind of message. So, quote, "It's likely more aspirational than realistic," said a senior US military official. Despite the increased numbers, Western allies have not seen evidence of sufficient changes to those forces' ability to carry out combined arms operations needed to take and hold new territory. Quote, "It's unlikely Russian forces will be particularly better organized, and so unlikely they'll be particularly more successful, though they do seem willing to send more troops into the meat grinder," a senior British official told CNN. The US military had assessed it would take as long as until May for the Russian military to regenerate enough power for a sustained offensive, but Russian leaders wanted action sooner. The US now sees it as likely that Russian forces are moving before they're ready due to political pressure from the Kremlin, the senior US military official told CNN. This is exactly what I've been saying the last few days, which is I have a feeling that Putin has said we need the Donbass by the end of March, and that's pushed the Russians to not doing a spring offensive, but a winter offensive, back end of winter, and they are doing this offensive without having the necessary personnel and materiel in place. And so therefore, for political ends, they are going to do a kind of half-assed offensive that arguably will not succeed because it is poorly thought through and rushed. So to continue the article, though Ukrainian officials have been sounding the alarm about new Russian attacks in the east, there is also skepticism on the Ukrainian side about Russian capabilities as those forces currently stand. Quote, "They amassed enough manpower, to take one or two small cities in the Donbass, but that's it," a senior Ukrainian diplomat told CNN. Quote, "Underwhelming compared to the sense of panic they were trying to build in Ukraine." So we did have this kind of claim a couple of weeks ago from Ukrainians that there's going to be a massive attack offensive. Now, you must remember that they might be saying those sort of things to kick the West and the US and other allied nations into action to give them more and more stuff. There's going to be a huge attack. Please help us. Okay, here's loads of stuff. Right, job done. Thank you. Or they may have actually genuinely believed that at the time, but now they're seeing that really there aren't the amassed troops and arguably air power that they were imagining, and so therefore this could be not a damp squib, but certainly less of an offensive than they were worried it would be. So the article finishes that and this builds on what actually Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, was saying yesterday in the Radio 4 Today programme. I played you a little bit of that earlier today. And the CNN article continues. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin said Tuesday in Brussels that the US is not seeing Russia, quote, massing its aircraft ahead of an aerial operation against Ukraine. So this is in light of these rumors going around on social media that there were a lot of Russian air capabilities amassing over the border in Russia. Whether that was the Russians putting that forward as a kind of psyops, but in terms of the actual, there were some claims that there were satellite images that showed this, but then cloud cover and whatnot, maybe making it more difficult to make a definite calculation. But Austin continues or states in this article, in terms of whether or not Russia is massing its aircraft for some massive aerial attack, we don't currently see that. We do know that Russia has a substantial number of aircraft in its inventory and a lot of capability left, he said. That's why we've emphasized that we need to do everything that we can to get Ukraine as much air defense capability as we possibly can. So it's not so much about concentrating on getting the aircraft over, as I talked about earlier, to Ukraine. Let's concentrate on air defense and knocking out the Russian air defense, and then we can talk about aircraft, possibly. Okay, moving on to something rather different here. It's just interesting to see how this war has gone. Right at the beginning, the first week of the war, a year's a long time, right? The first week of the war, most people are saying, well, Ukraine are going to get their butts kicked. And the Russians themselves on social media were saying, including, pretty important people like Medvedev, as you will see in a second, saying, well, game over. It's game over. But really, was it? So as this commentator says, what I really enjoy reading is Russian Telegram channels posts from the beginning of the full-scale invasion. How is the 3-day operation going? And this is something to ask of all the pro-Russian commenters in the threads below. It's like, oh yeah, wonderful. I know you disagree with everything I say, but how is that 3-day special military operation going? How is the SMO going? Is this an SMO? Is this still an SMO? Is this just a special military operation, or is it a full-blown war? And how's that going for you? You know, a year later, 15 days, a year later, going how you expected it? Because this was a kind of conversation that was happening at the beginning of the war. So says this particular person: air defense of Ukraine destroyed. Ukrainian air defense of Ukraine destroyed. Ukrainian aviation is destroyed. Ukrainian fleet is destroyed. Bayraktar TB2 Turkish air defense systems are no more. And then is it just? I mean, this is there are thousands of these, right? Another person says, turn to Z on February the 24th. According to our 100% data, the stationary air defense of Ukraine no longer exists. Apart from several months later, something like 85% of it still existed. But there you go. Probably because of this text, many people are angry at me. Vladimir Tatazki, February 24th. Pilots write, Russian aviation suppressed all air defense from this first approach. There were no targets left for the second event. And Medvedev says air defense. I don't know. That's quite. It probably is in Andrei Medvedev. Yeah. Air defense of Ukraine no longer exists. That is, in general, what the cruise missiles did not work in the first wave was destroyed by aviation. So from one event, Iskanders will be added. So these are missiles will be added to distant airfields based on the logic of modern warfare. And here we wrote more than once or twice. Air defense operators, Bayraktar, will be the main targets. That's how it turned out. So obviously the Google translation here isn't perfect, but the idea is that, hey, what we didn't take out in the first wave of missiles will be taken out by aviation. Air Force is gone. This is, game over. Yeah, but really, is that what happened? Evidently not. In fact, the airspace is still entirely contested, which is kind of what we've been talking about. Okay, just to sort of start wrapping things up, because I'm going to go over. Yes, I may leave the rest till later, actually. So I'm going to leave this video here now, and I'm going to do a second one a little bit later if I have time. But anyway, thank you so much for your viewership. I really appreciate all your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. And all the ways you can help the channel are in the description below. Really, really does help me. I really appreciate it. Thank you all the people who do buy me a coffee, PayPal, and all the members. Wonderful, wonderful people. Appreciate that. Anyway, take care, and I'll speak to you hopefully relatively soon.